The Chinese Cultural Revolution was one of the most chaotic times in human history. In this video, we are going to look at what it was and how China is still dealing with its consequences today. During his rule, he modernized the country and took it from an agricultural society to being a major industrial player. But his rule wasn't always smooth. The Great Leap Forward, for example, was a disastrous attempt to modernize agriculture that resulted in widespread famine. The Great Famine claimed somewhere between 15 to 55 million lives. Statues were torn down, buildings were destroyed, and artifacts were lost forever simply because they represented the old China that Mao wanted to get rid of. Many ancient artifacts were destroyed during this time, such as the famous Ming and Qing dynasty palaces and gardens. But perhaps even more important than physical artifacts was the loss of intangible cultural elements. Traditional arts and customs were suppressed and many cultural institutions were closed down. This has led to a lot of confusion and debate over what really happened during this time period. But some argue that the Cultural Revolution was necessary to save China. Millions of people were killed or imprisoned and traditional Chinese culture was almost destroyed. Also, a quick shout out to our supporters. Thanks so much for supporting us. If you want to see your name at the end of videos, then support us. The links are in the description. Now go watch this video. It's hard to imagine how any positive could come from such a horrific event. And yet some argue that it was necessary to save China and that it played a key role in the country's modernization. They point to the fact that China was on the verge of civil war in the 1960s and that the Cultural Revolution helped to stabilize the country. They also argue that the Cultural Revolution was a necessary step in China's modernization. By getting rid of the old ways of thinking and the traditional culture, China was able to become a modern industrial power. Finally, some argue that the Cultural Revolution should be seen in the context of the Cold War. The Cultural Revolution was in part a reaction against the influence of the West and a way of asserting Chinese nationalism. In this view, the Cultural Revolution was a necessary struggle to protect China from foreign influence. Many of the government's actions have been seen as an attempt to control the narrative and to downplay the severity of the Cultural Revolution. Some historians argue that the government is doing this in order to protect the legacy of Mao Zedong, who remains a controversial figure in Chinese politics. Others believe that the government is trying to avoid a repeat of the Cultural Revolution, which nearly brought the country to civil war. By downplaying the role of ideology and focusing instead on economic growth, the government hopes to prevent another mass movement that could destabilize the country. Whatever the reasons, this has led to a situation where the truth of the Cultural Revolution is still not widely known, and the debate over what really happened continues to be suppressed. This had a huge impact on Chinese society as a whole, and is still felt today. Even after his death, the Chinese government continued to suppress information about the Cultural Revolution. Mao wanted to create a new socialist man through the revolution, and this meant instilling the correct political ideology in the minds of the people. This led to the proliferation of propaganda, posters, books, and films all aimed at promoting Maoism and the Communist Party. These materials often depicted the struggle between the red and the expert and the importance of the Cultural Revolution in creating a better future for China. This focus on political education continues to this day, with the Chinese government placing a strong emphasis on patriotic education and the study of Mao Zedong's works. This is seen in everything from school curriculums to public displays of patriotism. For decades, it was illegal to talk about the events of the Cultural Revolution or even to question Mao. The revolution created a deep sense of insecurity and paranoia among the population, and this continues to be a problem today. People are afraid to speak out against the government or to criticize its policies for fear of retribution. This is especially true since the coming of the internet, when people have been able to communicate more freely with each other. But the government has cracked down hard on any dissent, and many people have been arrested for criticizing the government online. Another lasting legacy of the Cultural Revolution is the emphasis on obedience and conformity. The revolution was a time when people were encouraged to denounce their families and friends and to turn on one another. This created a society where people are afraid to be different and where they feel pressured to conform to the expectations of those around them. This is especially true in workplaces where employees are expected to put the needs of the company above their own. Finally, the Cultural Revolution also created a deep distrust of foreigners and foreign culture. The revolution was in part a reaction against the influence of the West, and this led to a period of isolationism and xenophobia. This continues to be a problem today as China tries to assert itself on the world stage. The government is wary of foreign influence, and this can make it difficult for foreigners to do business in China. This led to many people knowing very little about this dark period in their history. However, in recent years, the government has been trying to rewrite the narrative and claim that the Cultural Revolution was actually a good thing. We'll get to why later. Mao knew that he had made a terrible mistake, but needed to save face. So he did what any good leader would do. He started a revolution. Mao Zedong was the leader of the People's Republic of China from its creation in 19. Society was divided into two warring camps, the Red and the Expert. The Reds were the supporters of Mao and the workers and peasants, while the experts were the educated elite who lived in the cities. The goal of the revolution was to destroy the old ways of thinking and create a new socialist man through class struggle. This isn't too dissimilar to the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution. In fact, Mao's wife, Jiang Qing, was so enamored with the French Revolution that she named her newborn daughter after Marie Antoinette. That's not a great name if you're trying to hide from the secret police. In 1966, Mao declared that China was once again in a period of great change and turmoil. Most of the violence was committed by the Red Guards, groups of radicalized schoolchildren who were given little more than a book of Mao quotes and let loose on the population. They went around destroying property, beating people and forcing them to confess their crimes to a big crowd. These public humiliation sessions were called struggle sessions. One can only imagine the kind of things they said about someone in front of a crowd that would cause them to cry like this man here. After these sessions, the victims would be sent to labor camps where they could work themselves to death. It's estimated that as many as 2 million people were killed during the Cultural Revolution, though the true number is unknown. One of the strangest parts of the Cultural Revolution was the persecution of historical figures. One of the key aspects of the Cultural Revolution was the destruction of traditional Chinese culture. Another important aspect of the Cultural Revolution was the focus on political education. One of the most lasting legacies of the Cultural Revolution is the impact it had on Chinese society. As mentioned earlier, the Chinese government has been trying to rewrite the history of the Cultural Revolution in recent years. It is hard to imagine that anyone could support an event that resulted in the deaths of millions of people. However, there's no denying that the Cultural Revolution was a traumatic event in Chinese history. What do you think? Was the Cultural Revolution a necessary evil or an unjustifiable catastrophe? Let us know in the comments below.